The gospel message this morning is from Mark chapter 4, starting with verse 1. And again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got onto a boat on the sea and sat there while the whole crowd, was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And Jesus said, 'Let anyone with ears to hear listen.'" I really love this parable. It doesn't make any sense, which is why I love it. We call it the parable of the good sower, but the sower in the parable doesn't seem very good at all. I am not a farmer or a gardener, but I have watched some, like my father in his backyard vegetable garden, like subsistence farmers in Honduras with their dual crops of corn and beans. They do not sow like this, scattering the seeds over all kinds of ground. How stupid they would be. They would lose 3/4 of their crop from the outset, to the birds, to the weeds, to the scorching sun. The farmers and gardeners I have watched are very careful sowers. They count out the seeds, the right kind of soil, the right time of year. They make a hole just the right size. They gently cover over the seeds. They pour on just the right amount of water, not too much to drown, not too little to dry it out. And they watch and wait. They chase away the birds and rodents. They irrigate if they need to. They shade the tender sprouts. They tie them to stakes. They pull out choking weeds. And when the plants sprout, their work is not finished. My dad joked this summer as his butternut squash was sprouting that he would have to choose one plant out of each cluster of 3 or 4 and would have to murder most of the baby plants so the ones that were left could survive and give fruit. This is not the sower we see in this parable. This sower sows indiscriminately, showering all kinds of soil, all kinds of ground with the seeds, and apparently does not mind too much, knowing that he will lose 3/4 of his crop before it even sprouts. I started meditating on this parable almost exactly 1 year ago. I was in the middle of helping my Honduran church colleagues respond to communities that had been affected by the hurricanes Eta and Iota, which struck Honduras within 1 week of each other in November of 2020. As the hurricanes were still raging that November, and as the Presbyterian churches of Honduras were thanking God that they and their communities had been spared severe damage, I received a phone call from my friend and colleague, Alex Rodas. Alex wanted to act. We were watching people be rescued in rowboats from the tops of their houses. We were watching mudslides sweep away entire families. We didn't know it at the time, but some communities would be cut off from hospitals and supplies. Homes would be unlivable, filled with toxic mud for months. I have to do something, Alex told me. The church has to do something. Now, I'm not a farmer or a gardener or a first responder. I'm a pastor. The church itself has few financial resources and no experience mounting a mission and service effort like this on its own. The Honduran church has always been a recipient of mission, the needy side of a relationship between U.S. and Honduran partners. And we were 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. So many of our members had lost jobs, lost loved ones. Our churches were struggling just to stay afloat. So when Alex told me he thought the church should act in the face of this natural disaster, I was skeptical. What good would we do? Where would we even start? Alex, I said, I think we have to pray and trust that our prayers are enough. I wanted Alex to send his thoughts and prayers to those who were stranded on rooftops. Well, that was not good enough for Alex, or for the 40 Presbyterian volunteers he gathered to visit a mountainside community 3 weeks after the hurricanes had struck. These 40 volunteers included nurses, a psychologist, a pharmacist, pastors, teachers, many of whom had been educated in their professions with Presbyterian scholarships and who had spent their youth accompanying U.S. groups doing construction work or mounting medical clinics in their Presbyterian communities. They chose to go to a community that had no Presbyterian church, and this decision was not universally accepted at first. I'm sure that we've all heard similar doubting questions in our own conversations about mission and the church's role in our communities. Shouldn't the church be doing evangelism in these communities? Shouldn't the church's first responsibility be to its own members' spiritual health? We have no money. How can we afford to spend what little we have on strangers far away when our own communities have needs too? Again, my prophetic friend Alex was not swayed by these questions. His heart was broken with compassion for the people he saw suffering, and also for his church's own volunteers and young people. Alex had been accompanying mission workers for years, more than a decade really, helping U.S. Presbyterians connect with Honduran Presbyterians and seeing them experience transformation in the act of volunteering, serving their neighbors, constructing homes, installing solar panels and water purification systems, putting on rural medical clinics. Alex had seen the transformation that had taken place over a decade of partnership between U.S. and Honduran youth, mutual transformation on both sides of language and culture barriers. It recently occurred to me that Alex was so insistent that we help hurricane survivors not only because they needed help, but because we needed the transformation that comes with Christian service. The leap of faith we would need to take in order to decide who is our neighbor and how God calls the church to be in relationship to the communities that surround it. By the end of 2021, the Honduran Presbyterian Church had put on medical clinics, including psychological workshops, food distributions, in 4 different communities affected by Hurricanes Eta and Iota. They had given away 10,000 bags of weekly food supplies and treated around 1,000 patients. And in the middle of all that work, we started reflecting on this parable of the good sower. And most of my interpretation of this text now comes from those weeks of reflection with Honduran hurricane volunteers. Who is God in this parable? Well, the sower, of course, but this wasn't always the first answer. We thought maybe humans are the sower or Christians, but when we looked carefully at this biblical sower, we realized that the sower is not acting in a human way, conserving the seed, carefully choosing the ground. No. This sower is acting in a wholly other way, a godlike way, indiscriminately scattering seed, graciously scattering seed, abundantly scattering gracious seed all over the fields, hillsides, and roads. Who are we then in this parable? We thought maybe we're the seeds being scattered like Christian missionaries to serve the rocky, thorny soil, sometimes being attacked by satanic birds, sometimes being choked by sin and greed, being burned up by the scorching sun. But no, actually, we concluded we are the soil. We're the soil that's receiving the seed, the abundantly given and free grace of God. How do we know which kind of soil we are? By the fruit we produce in the end. How can we become good soil then? Well, that's the key question, isn't it? How does bad soil become good in the real world outside parabolic folk tales? Well, the farmer changes it. The farmer adds fertilizer, directs water, removes stones and weeds, protects the soil from invaders. It is hard, back-breaking work. I have seen Honduran farmers sow corn and sorghum on the literal sides of cliffs, walking up 50-degree hillsides to plow, haul water, carry their harvests on their own backs. Imagine that God is putting that kind of work into you and me to transform us, to cultivate us, to grow us into fertile ground for the seeds of grace. Alex knew that his Presbyterian siblings needed this kind of transformation that only comes from seeing Christ in the suffering face of one's neighbor. Alex knew that I and other U.S. friends of Honduras needed to see our Presbyterian siblings in an empowered place, enacting their call to serve their neighbors, hearing the call to do mission, and responding. I have been transformed over the past year by this reading of a familiar parable, and the Honduran Presbyterian Church has been slowly transformed as well. In November of this year, a year after Hurricanes Eta and Iota, some of the volunteers in the hurricane response completed a pilot project of working with the same communities to supply farming implements, fertilizer, compost to plant crops that had been lost in the hurricanes. And they have formed and proposed to the Honduras Presbytery a mission organization that will plan and direct the social action of the church, making an effort to redefine what the church's relationship with the larger community will be. These volunteers have come to believe that God is calling them to bear fruit and to see the world, not only their churches, as the recipients of God's abundant grace and love. May it be so.